Michael Jordan pulls over to help a broken-down car. The driver has no idea who he is. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Michael Jordan, now far removed from his playing days, had found peace in the quiet moments of life. He spent much of his time working on his various business ventures, overseeing his stake in the Charlotte Hornets, and staying involved in his family's lives. The chaos of the NBA, the constant spotlight, and the pressure to be the best were behind him. The weight of a career that spanned decades had been replaced by the freedom to take things at his own pace. One afternoon, on a seemingly uneventful drive between Charlotte and Atlanta, Michael found himself behind the wheel of his car, alone. He was used to long drives like this, with no one but his thoughts for company. The road between these two cities was familiar, yet there was something calming about the quiet, the lack of attention, and the anonymity he could still find outside the cities and the stadiums. As he cruised down the rural highway, something caught his eye. An old car pulled over to the side of the road, the hood raised, and a man standing next to it, hands on his hips. Michael didn't hesitate. Without thinking, he slowed his car and pulled over behind the old vehicle. The man, a middle-aged stranger with graying hair and withered hands, was attempting to figure out the problem with his car, but it was clear he was struggling. As Michael got out of the car, the man looked up, his face filled with mild concern but no hint of panic. "Need a hand?" Michael asked, walking over to the man. Yeah, I've got a flat tire," the man responded, his voice warm and friendly, but full of frustration. "Can't get it changed without a jack, though. Been stuck here a while." Michael took a quick glance at the car. It wasn't much to look at, a tired old sedan with chipped paint and rust in places that had clearly seen better days. He noticed the man's hands tremble a bit as he fiddled with the tire iron, clearly frustrated by his lack of success. Michael immediately offered his help. "I've got a jack in the trunk," Michael said, heading back to his car. The man, still unaware of who he was, smiled and nodded. "Thanks, I appreciate it," he said. As Michael retrieved the jack and started to work, the man struck up a conversation. "You know, I used to watch a lot of basketball back in the day," he said, trying to make small talk while they worked. "The game's changed a lot since then. I remember when I first started following it, back in the 80s, when the Celtics and the Lakers were going at it every year." Michael smiled to himself, finding it amusing that the man was so absorbed in his recollections that he didn't even recognize the famous basketball legend standing next to him. Michael was well accustomed to people recognizing him, but it was refreshing to be treated as just another person, someone who was simply helping out. "Yeah, those were some intense years," Michael replied, tightening the tire bolts. The man, continuing to speak about the days when basketball was just beginning to reach the heights it would eventually hit, began to tell Michael stories of his own experiences watching the NBA. He spoke with passion about Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, about the fierce competition of the 80s, and the legendary figures who had shaped the league. Michael didn't interrupt him, just nodded and listened. He appreciated the man's enthusiasm. In a strange way, it felt like a break from the constant demands for his attention. It felt like he could be himself for a moment, without the weight of his fame pressing down on him. "Man, I tell you, I don't think the game's been the same since Jordan came along," the man continued, not knowing that the very person he was speaking about was standing right beside him. "That kid was something else. You remember the 90s, right? The way he just took over the league. I think he might be the best player ever to play the game." Michael smiled but didn't say a word. The man was completely unaware that he was speaking to the very person he admired. He went on and on about Jordan's relentless work ethic, his jump shot, his championships. Michael had heard it all before, of course, but hearing it from this stranger, who had no idea who he was, made it feel different. It felt less like praise and more like an honest reflection of the man's love for the game and the players who had defined it. There was something refreshing about the man's nostalgia, a reminder of how much the game had evolved since those days. As the tire was finally changed and the car was ready to go, the elderly man expressed his gratitude, completely unaware of the identity of the person who had helped him. Michael, still smiling, gave him a handshake and wished him well. Take care of yourself, all right? Michael said, before getting back into his own car. The man waved, still talking about his love for the game, and Michael couldn't help but chuckle to himself as he pulled away. Driving off, Michael reflected on the interaction. In that moment, he was reminded of something that had been missing from his life for a long time, the simplicity of just being a person, helping someone without the weight of expectation. It had been so long since he had experienced a moment like that, where he could be just Michael, and not Michael Jordan, the icon. It felt good. For the elderly man, it was simply another day of bad luck on the road. He would probably never know that the person who helped him was one of the greatest basketball players to ever live. And that was just fine. Michael wasn't concerned with recognition, he was concerned with the small moments that made life worth living. Helping a stranger on the side of the road had been just one of those moments. It was a simple act of kindness, one that didn't require the spotlight or the praise that Michael had grown so accustomed to. It was just two people, sharing a conversation and a moment, and for Michael, it was a moment of clarity. Life wasn't always about the big games, the huge wins, or the accolades. Sometimes, it was just about being human, about making a difference in someone else's day without expecting anything in return. For a moment, Michael had been able to step away from the fame and just be someone who helped a stranger in need. The experience stayed with him for days after. It wasn't a story for the media, and it wasn't something he would share with anyone. It was just a personal memory, one of the rare times he had felt completely anonymous, and in a way, he realized that the absence of fame in that moment had been a gift. But even so, Michael Jordan knew deep down that he could never truly escape the life that had shaped him. Whether he was helping someone on the side of the road or running a multi-million-dollar business, his legacy would always follow him. And in that quiet moment, on that country road between Charlotte and Atlanta, he had come to accept that. He didn't need to be recognized by everyone. What mattered most was how he carried himself, in the smallest and most unexpected moments. Michael Jordan had been driving for a while, the road stretching out in front of him without a care. The solitude of the highway, the endless stretches of green and empty space between Charlotte and Atlanta, gave him a rare sense of peace. As a retired basketball legend, the constant public attention was no longer a part of his daily routine. He could now drive for hours without the flashes of cameras or fans approaching him for an autograph. He was Michael Jordan, yes, but he was also just another person trying to get somewhere, enjoying the little moments when he didn't have to be in the spotlight. It was around midday when he came across the elderly man stranded on the side of the road. The car, an old sedan, was parked with its hood raised, a clear sign that something was wrong. Michael could see the man trying to fix the issue, but it was evident that the situation was beyond his abilities. The man's hands, rough and worn from years of hard work, struggled with a tire iron, and Michael immediately felt the instinct to help. Pulling over, Michael rolled his window down and leaned out. "Everything all right?" he called out to the man. The elderly man looked up, squinting against the sunlight, and his face lit up with relief. "Oh, thank God. I've been stuck here for a while. I've got a flat, and it looks like I don't have the right tools to fix it. I could use a hand." Michael stepped out of his car and walked over to the man, offering a hand to shake. "No problem. Let me help you get that fixed." The man didn't seem to recognize him at first. He was focused on the task at hand, more concerned about getting back on the road than about who had stopped to help. Michael opened his trunk, pulling out the jack and tools needed for the repair. The elderly man watched closely as Michael went about fixing the flat tire, still oblivious to the fact that the man helping him was, in fact, Michael Jordan, the icon of basketball. "You know, back in the day, they used to make cars to last," the man said, chuckling as he wiped his hands on a rag. "This old thing's held up pretty well, but it sure doesn't want to cooperate when I need it the most." Michael smiled, appreciating the man's sense of humor. It happens. Sometimes the best things in life have their moments of trouble. As Michael worked, the man's conversation shifted from cars to basketball, almost as if it was second nature. "You know, I used to watch a lot of basketball in the 80s. The game was something else back then, way before all the fancy moves they're doing today. It was just pure, tough basketball. Magic and Larry, those guys, they knew how to play the game right. Michael nodded, keeping his tone light as he continued with the tire. Yeah, that was an incredible era. Magic and Bird really did change the league. The elderly man's eyes lit up. You know, I don't think I ever saw a player quite like Jordan. The way he played was just different. Every game, it was like he was playing for the future of the sport, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Just amazing. Michael didn't comment immediately. Instead, he just kept working, content to listen to the man as he spoke about his admiration for basketball from the golden years, completely unaware of the fact that he was sitting right next to the very person he admired. I'll tell you, though, the man continued, the NBA today is not what it used to be. Back then, it was all about real players. You know, the ones who played hard every night, who gave it everything for the game. Michael had heard similar things 1,000 times before. His mind drifted briefly to those days when the NBA was less polished, when the rivalries were personal, when the competition was a reflection of the fierce pride of every player. But listening to the man's passion reminded him of how he had first fallen in love with the game, when it was more than just entertainment, when it was about something real. Yeah, the game's definitely changed, Michael finally replied. But that's part of what makes it great. Every era brings something new. The elderly man nodded, still unaware of the man in front of him. I don't know about you, but I miss the days when players like you didn't need all that extra flair, just the basics, the heart, the game itself. That's what made you stand out. Michael couldn't help but smile. I guess I was one of those guys, he said with a laugh. The elderly man seemed to appreciate the humility, not knowing how much truth there was in Michael's statement. Hard work in the basics, that's where it all starts. The car tire was soon fixed, and Michael was just finishing up the last few turns when the man, who had been lost in his own conversation, finally turned his attention to his helper. You know, I have to say, you're a good guy for stopping to help. I've been stuck out here for hours, and not one person even slowed down. Just goes to show, not everyone's in a rush. Michael chuckled, brushing his hands off as he put the tools away. You'd be surprised how many people are willing to help when you just ask. The elderly man seemed to hesitate for a moment before looking up at Michael again, this time a bit more curious. I never caught your name, friend. Michael hesitated for just a second before answering, keeping it simple. Michael. The man nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. Well, Michael, I appreciate the help. It's a rarity to find someone willing to give a hand these days. Michael gave him a small, knowing smile. Glad I could help. As the man thanked him once again, Michael took a step back, getting into his car. The conversation had been a pleasant distraction, a reminder of why he loved the game so much, because it had a way of bringing people together. But there was something special about this moment. It wasn't about the glory of his own name, or the legacy that followed him everywhere. It was about being a simple person, helping out when it was needed, without any fanfare or recognition. The elderly man continued to talk basketball, as though he hadn't just spent the last hour speaking to the greatest player of the game. Michael chuckled softly as he pulled away, feeling a sense of satisfaction that went beyond the simple act of helping. He had been Michael Jordan for so many years, but today, he was just Michael. That was enough for him. He didn't need recognition, and neither did the elderly man. The moment had been genuine, a shared connection over something they both loved, and in that simplicity, Michael felt something rare, peace. As the miles passed, Michael thought about the many interactions he had in his life, the fans, the media, the sponsors. He was used to being seen, to being a symbol of greatness. But the simplicity of this moment reminded him of something more important. It wasn't about being seen, it was about being present. And sometimes, the most profound moments came from the quietest acts. As Michael drove away, the conversation with the elderly man stayed with him. It wasn't often that he had the chance to engage with someone who didn't know who he was, someone who wasn't already starstruck by his presence. To this man, Michael was just another guy who had pulled over to help fix a flat tire. The man's genuine love for the game and his nostalgia for the good old days of basketball resonated deeply with Michael. It had been a long time since anyone had talked to him about basketball in such an unassuming, casual way. The stories the man shared weren't about the glory of championships, the bright lights of the NBA, or Michael's own iconic moments. Instead, they were about the game in its rawest form, the days when basketball was played for the love of the game, before the commercial frenzy, before the world had started to build players into gods. The man's admiration for the game was clear, but it wasn't laced with the pressure or reverence that often came when people spoke to Michael about his own career. There was a refreshing humility in his voice, and in that humility, Michael found comfort. As he drove further down the road, Michael thought about the times in his life when basketball had been just a game that he loved, a game that brought him joy, long before it became a business, long before he was a global brand. It was easy to forget, sometimes, in the whirlwind of competition and success, that basketball was just a sport, a means of connection, and a platform to do something greater than oneself. The elderly man had reminded him of that, whether he realized it or not. For the first time in a long while, Michael allowed himself to think beyond the fame, beyond the statistics, beyond the legacy that had been built. He thought about what it meant to truly enjoy the sport again, to experience the purity of competition without the burden of being Michael Jordan, the icon. That interaction had given him a glimpse of the kind of freedom he hadn't had in years. It was in these quieter moments that Michael found solace, away from the stadiums, away from the constant pressure to perform, away from the game that had defined so much of his life. The basketball court, as much as it had been his stage, had also been his prison. The expectations, the demands, the constant focus on what he could do next, there were times when all he wanted was to walk away, to just be a normal person again. The elderly man, with his stories of basketball's past and his unwitting connection to Michael's own journey, had reminded him that it was okay to take a step back. It was okay to be just a man on the side of the road, helping another man in need. Michael thought about how often people approached him, hoping for a glimpse of the icon, the superstar who had brought the Chicago Bulls to the pinnacle of basketball greatness. He had grown accustomed to the attention, but there was something about today's encounter that felt different. The man didn't want anything from him. He didn't want a picture, an autograph, or a conversation about Jordan's 6 championships. He just wanted help with a flat tire, and Michael had given it to him. The simplicity of that exchange was refreshing. In a world where everything was tied to branding, fame, and expectations, it was a reminder that there was still room for kindness, for human connection that didn't rely on recognition. Michael wasn't an NBA legend to that man, he was just a fellow driver on a lonely stretch of highway, offering help where it was needed. The thought of the elderly man's undisturbed view of the NBA, of the league that Michael had dominated for years, brought a smile to his face. The man didn't get caught up in the comparisons or the relentless pursuit of greatness. He wasn't interested in who was the best player or who had the most titles. To him, basketball was about memories, about what the game meant to him in the years before it became a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. It was about the players who played with heart, players like Magic and Bird, and the way they inspired fans with their commitment to the game. As Michael continued his drive, he realized that he had spent so many years defining himself by his role in the game, by the titles, the accolades, and the recognition. But the most meaningful moments in life weren't measured by stats or fame. They were measured by the people you helped, the small gestures of kindness that went unnoticed by the world but made a difference to the individuals involved. For a moment, Michael let himself think about what life would look like without the fame, without the expectations. What if he didn't have to be Michael Jordan, the living legend, everywhere he went? What if he could simply be Michael, the man who loved basketball, the man who had worked hard to make his dream a reality? What if he could just be himself, without the pressure to constantly live up to the world's expectations? The thought was liberating. But, as Michael knew all too well, it was impossible to live in complete anonymity when you had built a legacy like his. Everywhere he went, he was Michael Jordan, the best basketball player to ever play the game. He could try to escape it, but it would always follow him. The question was no longer about trying to outrun his fame. It was about finding peace within it, about making sure that the person who had become a legend was still the same person who had fallen in love with basketball in the first place. By the time Michael reached Atlanta, the sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The road ahead seemed longer now, filled with more than just miles and destinations. It had become a journey of reflection, a reminder that there was still more to be discovered beyond the game. Basketball had given him everything: his platform, his fame, his success. But in the quiet moments of his life, he realized that there was more to him than the game. And he had the rest of his life to figure out who he was when he wasn't on the court. As he entered the city, Michael thought back to the old man on the side of the road. That moment, brief and simple as it had been, had offered him something invaluable: a sense of humility, a reminder that fame and success didn't define his worth. It was how he treated others, how he lived his life when no one was watching, that would truly matter. And in that small, seemingly insignificant encounter, Michael had learned something he hadn't realized he needed to learn. The next chapter of his life would be about finding balance, about using the influence he had built for good, but also about rediscovering what it meant to be Michael Jordan without the pressures of being the best. For once, he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. All he had to do was be present, be there for the people who mattered, be there for the game that had shaped him, and be there for himself. That afternoon, as he made his way through the streets of Atlanta, Michael knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. The road ahead, much like the one that had led him here, was open, and he was ready to see where it took him. The days of defining himself solely by his legacy were behind him. Now, it was time to define who he would be without the spotlight. The encounter on the highway had been a turning point for Michael Jordan. As he settled into his hotel room later that night in Atlanta, he couldn't shake the thought of the elderly man, still completely unaware of who he was. Michael had often been recognized wherever he went, whether it was at a restaurant, a store, or even on the street. But today, in the quiet simplicity of that interaction, he had been Michael, not the global superstar. It was a rare feeling, one he hadn't experienced in years, and it left him feeling oddly refreshed. He had helped the man without expectation, without the need for fanfare. For once, he had been able to step away from the pressure of being Michael Jordan, the basketball legend. The anonymity felt liberating. It reminded him of a time in his life when things were simpler, when basketball was just a game, not the spectacle it had become. As he sat on the edge of the bed, his thoughts turned to his post-basketball life. There had been so many chapters to his career, each one marked by different struggles and triumphs. But now, years removed from the game, Michael had come to realize that his legacy wasn't just about championships or records. It was about how he had influenced the world, how his story had inspired millions, and how he had been able to give back to the communities that had supported him. The truth was, Michael had never sought the limelight for himself. His passion for basketball had driven him, but it was the journey, the endless pursuit of greatness, that had shaped him. The admiration, the accolades, they had always come second. It had been the work, the dedication, and the commitment that mattered most. The feeling of pushing himself beyond his limits, of achieving something that others thought impossible, that had been his true motivation. But now, in the quiet of this hotel room, Michael realized that his identity had become tied to more than just basketball. His business ventures, his involvement with the Charlotte Hornets, and his philanthropic work had all become central to who he was. He was no longer just a guy who made jump shots or scored 30 points a game. He was a businessman, a mentor, a philanthropist, someone whose influence reached far beyond the basketball court. Yet, he found himself longing for the purity of the game, for the days when it was just about the love of playing. The day on the highway had sparked something in him, an understanding that, despite all the success, there was still a part of him that longed for simpler times. For the first time in years, Michael felt like he could take a step back, even from the demanding schedule of his current life. The weight of his legacy, the expectations of being Michael Jordan, had started to feel like a burden. He had spent so many years defining himself by his accomplishments that it had become difficult to remember who he was without them. The problem was that the world had already made him a symbol. People saw him as the greatest of all time, the man who had revolutionized the game, the athlete who had become a cultural icon. And while that recognition was flattering, it also trapped him in a box. Everywhere he went, there were reminders of his greatness: newspapers, documentaries, interviews, commercials. The accolades, the trophies, they followed him everywhere. It was difficult to escape it, to just be Michael. But today, on that quiet highway, he had found a fleeting sense of freedom. It wasn't about basketball, it wasn't about his fame. It was just about helping someone, a fellow human being in need, without any expectation or recognition. Michael realized that this was the kind of peace he had been seeking. Not the adoration of fans or the admiration of his peers, but the kind of fulfillment that came from being part of something bigger than himself. It wasn't about winning titles or being on top. It was about using his success to make a difference, to quietly touch people's lives without the need for the spotlight. For Michael, this realization was both humbling and liberating. It wasn't easy for someone who had spent his entire life being defined by his performance on the court. But as he looked back on his career, he realized that the most fulfilling moments had never been the games themselves. It had always been the moments after, the ways in which he had inspired others, the ways in which he had given back. Whether it was through his charitable work, his mentorship of young athletes, or the way he had connected with his fans, Michael knew that his true legacy was about more than just basketball. It was also about the people he had touched along the way. As he continued his journey through retirement, Michael found himself more invested in the Hornets, in his businesses, and in the work he was doing behind the scenes. But he also found that he had time for things that mattered more, his family, his friends, and the quiet moments that had once seemed impossible to find. He no longer had to be the athlete on the court, the man always in the spotlight. He could just be Michael, the husband, the father, the mentor. It was a shift in perspective that he had needed for years. The time away from basketball had also allowed him to reflect on the game itself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that basketball had never just been about the competition. It had always been about connection. The connection with his teammates, the connection with his fans, and the connection with the game itself. That was what had driven him, what had kept him going even when it seemed like he had nothing left to prove. It wasn't about winning championships, it was about pushing himself, challenging himself, and finding joy in the process. And that was why the conversation with the elderly man had resonated so deeply. The man wasn't interested in Michael Jordan the legend, he was interested in basketball. He was interested in the love of the game, in the memories it had created for him, and in the players who had come before him. In a world so obsessed with fame and recognition, the man's focus on the pure joy of basketball had reminded Michael of why he had fallen in love with the game in the first place. As he lay down in bed that night, Michael's thoughts wandered to his future. The basketball world had given him everything, but he knew there was more to life. The road ahead wasn't about how many more deals he could close or how much more money he could make. It was about how he could continue to give back, how he could use his platform to make a difference, and how he could continue to grow as a person, away from the fame and pressure that had defined his earlier years. The legacy of Michael Jordan had already been written. He was a legend, one of the greatest basketball players to ever live. But the next chapter, the one that had yet to be written, was where the true challenge lay. It wasn't about proving himself again or chasing something he'd already achieved. It was about finding peace in the simple moments, about reconnecting with the love of the game, and about finding ways to use his influence to inspire others in ways that went beyond basketball. For Michael Jordan, the journey was far from over. And now, with a new understanding of what truly mattered, he was ready to face the future with a sense of purpose that went beyond the court. The moments of connection, the acts of kindness, the quiet reflections, they would define the man he would continue to become. And in those moments, he would find the peace he had been seeking all along. Michael's life after basketball had been a shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. For so many years, his identity had been inseparable from the game. Even after his retirement, he remained the face of basketball, the name that fans across the world recognized. Yet now, he was transitioning into a different role, the mentor, the businessman, the philanthropist. This new phase of his life was quieter, but it also required a sense of purpose that wasn't always tied to winning. The day with the elderly man on the highway had brought something unexpected into focus for Michael. It reminded him of the value of being present in a moment without the pressure of living up to the expectations the world had set for him. He didn't need to be Michael Jordan, the basketball icon, and those few minutes helping a stranger. He was simply a person who had stopped to help, and that act felt more meaningful than any slam dunk or game-winning shot. It wasn't that he resented his fame, far from it. He was immensely grateful for the career he had built, for the platform it had given him, and for the impact he had made both on and off the court. But what he realized that day was that he could be more than just his accomplishments. He could be someone who was just Michael, the man who had loved the game, who had given everything to it, but who had more to offer than just basketball. There was more to his legacy than his 6 NBA championships or the countless accolades. There was something deeper about how he chose to live his life beyond the spotlight. As he sat in the driver's seat of his car on his way back to Charlotte, Michael found himself thinking about the paths that had led him here. The memories of his early days, when he wasn't yet a household name, when he was just a kid in North Carolina with big dreams, reminded him of the hunger that had driven him. He remembered the countless hours spent in the gym, the moments of failure that had only fueled his desire to be great. It wasn't just about proving the doubters wrong, it was about pushing the limits of what he could achieve. But now, after so many years, the hunger for accolades had faded, replaced by a new kind of purpose. Michael's involvement with the Charlotte Hornets had become a critical part of his post-basketball journey. Taking on the responsibility of an owner was no small feat. It required a different mindset, one that wasn't focused on personal success, but on creating an environment where success could be sustained for years to come. The team was far from an established championship contender when Michael became involved, but he approached the challenge with the same intensity he had brought to basketball. It wasn't just about winning, it was about building something that would stand the test of time, about creating a foundation for future generations to grow. He wasn't the same player who had once dominated on the court, but his leadership still had the same impact. Michael focused on helping players develop, not just their skills, but their mindset. He wanted them to understand what it took to be great, what it meant to give everything to the game. He wasn't concerned with the immediate rewards, but with building a team that could sustain excellence in the long term. His legacy was no longer just about his own individual accomplishments, it was about passing on his knowledge, his experience, to the next generation. But the journey wasn't always smooth. There were moments of frustration, times when it seemed like the team was going nowhere. Michael's competitive nature didn't allow him to accept mediocrity. He was used to the pressure of being the best, to the expectation that he could turn things around at will. Yet, the NBA had changed since his playing days. There were new dynamics, new players, and a different kind of business to navigate. The adjustment was challenging, but it pushed Michael to grow in ways he hadn't expected. It taught him patience, humility, and the importance of perseverance. In addition to his work with the Hornets, Michael had thrown himself into philanthropic endeavors. Over the years, he had made substantial donations to causes related to education, youth development, and community outreach. His foundation had become a cornerstone of his post-basketball life, and it gave him a sense of fulfillment that basketball never had. The idea of giving back was something that had always been important to him, but now, with the freedom to focus on it more, he saw how much more he could do. Helping young people realize their potential, offering opportunities to those who might not have had them otherwise, became just as important to him as winning a championship. But it wasn't always easy. The world of philanthropy, like basketball, was filled with challenges. There were times when he doubted whether his efforts were making a difference, whether the changes he was advocating for were enough. The stakes were different now, and there were no accolades or trophies to show for his hard work. It wasn't the same as being named Finals MVP. Yet, when he saw the difference his foundation made in the lives of children, when he watched a young athlete achieve their dreams because of the opportunities his donations had provided, he found a sense of satisfaction that had always eluded him in his playing days. In many ways, these efforts were more meaningful than any victory he had ever achieved. Michael had spent a lifetime working to be the best, but now he understood that the greatest victories weren't about titles or records. They were about the impact you made on others, the lives you changed, and the legacy you built not just for yourself, but for the world. His basketball legacy would always remain, but his true legacy was about more than the game, it was about the lasting difference he could make. Even with all his success, however, Michael still faced moments of doubt. It was hard not to compare the satisfaction of giving back with the high of winning championships. He had spent years at the top of the basketball world, and while he had adapted to his new life, there were times when he missed the thrill of the game, the competition, the fans, the chase for greatness. The quiet moments, the ones spent helping others, were rewarding, but they didn't always fill the void left by basketball. He wasn't sure if that void would ever be fully filled. The intensity, the pressure, it had become a part of him, and in some ways, he missed it. But, in other ways, he was grateful for the space that had opened up in his life. The day he had spent helping the elderly man with the flat tire kept coming back to him. It wasn't just the kindness he had shown, or the simplicity of the moment that he had enjoyed. It was the reminder that, despite everything he had accomplished, he could still find joy in small, unexpected encounters. It was a reminder that the world was bigger than basketball, that there were other ways to connect with people beyond the confines of the game. That was something Michael had rarely allowed himself to experience when he was at the peak of his career. He had been so focused on winning that he sometimes missed out on the beauty of life beyond the game. As he drove home that evening, Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The day had been full of simple moments, a conversation with a stranger, helping someone in need, sharing thoughts about basketball without the weight of competition. It had been a reminder that life didn't always have to be about the big wins, the grand achievements. Sometimes, it was the quiet moments of connection that mattered the most. And in those moments, Michael found something more valuable than any championship he had ever won: peace. Michael found himself reflecting on the road ahead as he continued his journey in retirement. The change had come more gradually than he had expected, but now, it felt as though he was settling into a new chapter in life. The days of dominating the basketball court, of turning every game into a performance worthy of the headlines, were long behind him. But even now, the lingering question persisted: what came after being Michael Jordan, the greatest player of all time? Despite all the accolades, all the trophies, the answer wasn't easy to find. The basketball world had celebrated his achievements with reverence, placing him on a pedestal that very few could ever dream of reaching. But the older he got, the more Michael realized that those moments of glory didn't hold the same weight as they once had. He had achieved more than he ever thought possible, but the true meaning of success, what truly mattered, had shifted. The day he helped the elderly man with the flat tire had stayed with him in a way he couldn't quite shake off. It wasn't the help he had given that resonated so much, it was the simplicity of the exchange. There were no cameras, no press conferences, no expectations. It was just Michael, a man helping another man in need. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't Michael Jordan, the basketball icon. He was just someone who pulled over to lend a hand. That small, almost mundane moment reminded him that sometimes the greatest connections came without the spotlight, without the accolades. Back in Charlotte, life had become a series of balancing acts. There were the responsibilities of running the Hornets, managing his business ventures, and being an active presence in his community. But it wasn't all about work and legacy building. He had made a conscious decision to reconnect with his family and friends in ways that had become impossible when basketball had consumed his life. He wanted to experience life as a husband, a father, and a mentor, not just the figurehead that everyone saw on TV or in magazines. For years, he had lived in a world where his every move was scrutinized, his every word analyzed. Now, he could finally breathe, knowing that he didn't have to be perfect, that he didn't have to be Michael Jordan the icon 24/7. His involvement with the Hornets had been an eye-opening experience, and not just because of the wins and losses. In basketball, Michael was accustomed to being the one who changed the outcome of the game, who put his team on his back in the clutch moments. As an owner, he had to accept that he was no longer the one on the court making the difference. It was a humbling adjustment. His leadership was now based on guiding his team in a different way, nurturing talent, fostering a culture of teamwork, and teaching resilience. For the first time, he had to rely on others to take charge in ways that he once did on his own. It was a new kind of pressure, one that he wasn't used to. He had to trust that the people around him would take the lessons he had learned and apply them. For Michael, this was the ultimate test. Could he still be a winner without being on the court? Could he still contribute to the game he loved in ways that weren't defined by personal achievements? The journey wasn't always easy. The Hornets had a ways to go before they could compete at a championship level. But that was part of the process, Michael knew. Building something from the ground up required patience. The challenge wasn't just about molding players into stars, it was about building a team that worked together as a cohesive unit. He had learned that much from his own days with the Bulls. Championships weren't won by individual players, they were won by teams that functioned as a singular force, united in purpose and effort. Even though Michael wasn't on the court, he still felt the same drive. He still pushed himself to be the best in everything he did. It wasn't about making the same dazzling plays he had once made, but about applying the same work ethic to his new life. Whether it was helping the team succeed, making business deals, or raising his family, he threw himself into everything with the same passion and intensity that had defined his playing days. At the same time, Michael had begun to feel the weight of his legacy. The more he was involved in the Hornets, the more he realized how much responsibility he carried, not just for his own success, but for the impact he had on others. His reputation, his influence, was still immense. It didn't matter if he was on the court or in a boardroom, the expectations followed him. Everywhere he went, he was Michael Jordan, and people looked to him for guidance, inspiration, and answers. While it was flattering to know that his legacy was something people admired, it was also a heavy burden to bear. But through it all, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, knowing that he was making a difference. His involvement with the team, the young players he mentored, and his charitable work all had a lasting impact. He had always been driven by the desire to be the best, but now, he saw that greatness could be measured by more than just what you did on the court. It was about what you did with your life beyond basketball. It was about using your platform to inspire, to create opportunities for others, and to leave a lasting legacy. The philanthropic work he had been doing also played a large role in his sense of fulfillment. He had always known that his platform could be used for something greater, but now, he saw the direct impact of his efforts. His foundation had supported numerous initiatives, from education to healthcare to economic development in underserved communities. Michael was able to meet with young people whose lives had been changed because of the resources his foundation provided. Watching them succeed, watching them achieve their dreams, brought him a sense of joy that no championship could ever replicate. Yet, despite the good work he was doing, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The quiet moments he shared with his family, the time he spent with his children, gave him a sense of peace. But there was still a part of him that longed for the rush of competition, for the feeling of the ball in his hands with the game on the line. It wasn't just about the victories, it was about the feeling of being part of something larger than himself. Basketball had given him that. It had given him the chance to become part of a story that would be remembered for generations. But now, as a retired legend, he had to find new ways to channel that energy. He realized, however, that his time in the spotlight was over. The world had moved on, and so had he. It was no longer about personal accolades or individual greatness. The challenge now was to pass on the lessons he had learned, to teach the next generation that success was about more than just being the best player on the court, it was about being the best person off it. And in the end, Michael realized that the greatest legacy he could leave wasn't just one of championships, but one of leadership, resilience, and giving back. As the days passed, Michael continued to stay involved with the Hornets, but he also made time for his family. He recognized that the most valuable moments were the ones spent at home, the quiet evenings spent talking with his wife, the trips he took with his children, and the time he spent mentoring young players. These were the moments that mattered the most now. Basketball had given him everything he could have asked for, but it was life beyond the court that was giving him something far more valuable, peace. And in that peace, Michael had found the answer to the question he had been asking himself for so long: who was he without the game? He was Michael Jordan, the man who had transcended the game. And in that realization, he finally understood that the greatest victory of all wasn't about being the best player ever, it was about being the best version of himself. Michael drove through the streets of Charlotte, his hometown, the familiar sights no longer causing the rush of excitement they once did. He had passed through these roads countless times, but today, they felt different. He wasn't Michael Jordan, the basketball star today, he was Michael Jordan, the man who had done everything in basketball but now needed to find purpose beyond it. His years of on-court glory seemed like they belonged to another life. The truth was, he had moved into a phase where the future wasn't about championship rings or MVP trophies, it was about redefining who he was. The Charlotte Hornets, his basketball team, were a key part of that future. When Michael first bought the team, he didn't know exactly what the role would require of him, but he had a deep understanding of competition and winning. He had learned from the best and had been shaped by the brutal, constant battle to stay on top of his game. Now, instead of leading a team to a title, he was leading from the sidelines, guiding them toward a future they hadn't yet reached. That task felt just as fulfilling as any championship had. The effort was what mattered. It was about building something lasting and meaningful, something more than personal achievement. But even in this new role, the competitive fire still burned inside him, urging him to push harder, do more, achieve greatness in this new realm. As he sat in his office at the Hornets facility, Michael's thoughts returned to the encounter on the highway with the elderly man. He had been so immersed in that simple act of kindness that he hadn't realized how much it had impacted him. It wasn't just that he had helped someone in need, it was the humbling nature of that experience. There were no accolades, no recognition, and that was exactly what he had been craving. It wasn't about the applause or the praise, it was about genuine human connection. In a world full of cameras and lights, it had been refreshing to just be a man helping another man. That was a reality he hadn't often had a chance to experience. Michael looked out of his office window, watching the hustle and bustle of the city below. The thought of his legacy continued to linger in his mind. The basketball world had already defined him as the greatest, but he was now grappling with the question of what else there was to leave behind. What did a man do once he had done it all? The world knew Michael Jordan for his 6 NBA championships, his countless accolades, and his status as the greatest basketball player to ever live. But what was he supposed to do now? The game had given him everything, and yet, there was a feeling of emptiness that lingered after the final buzzer had sounded. In his personal life, Michael had made strides to reconnect with his family. He had always been a devoted father and husband, but his time away from the game had allowed him to be present in ways he never had before. He could attend his kids' school events, take his wife out for dinner without the distraction of cameras, and enjoy quiet moments at home without the pressure of being the icon everyone expected him to be. The simplicity of those moments, those mundane, everyday activities, began to matter more than any public appearance, any trophy or endorsement deal. His relationship with his children had deepened as well. Now that they were older, he could share his experiences with them, not as a legend on a pedestal, but as a father who had learned from his mistakes. He could talk to them about the value of hard work, of staying true to oneself, of never giving up. He realized that, just as he had been shaped by his father's wisdom, his own children would be shaped by his lessons. He wasn't just a teacher in basketball anymore, he was teaching them about life, and that, in many ways, felt like his most important role. But even as he embraced this quieter life, Michael couldn't escape the feeling that something was still missing. He had always thrived on challenges, and now, without the competition of the court, he found himself searching for new goals. Running a basketball team was different from playing in the NBA, but the essence of competition remained. He couldn't help but feel like he was at a crossroads. The thrill of basketball was still a part of him, but he had moved on from the game in many ways. The team wasn't yet a contender for a championship, and while that wasn't entirely under his control, it was difficult not to want to take immediate action. His competitive instinct still pushed him to demand excellence. Yet, even with all his involvement in the team, Michael understood that the true value of his role wasn't in the victories. It was in how he had helped shape the franchise, and how he had created a culture of accountability and grit. Michael wasn't looking for the same rush of adrenaline he had once felt in the final seconds of a game. Instead, he was finding satisfaction in the long-term vision, building something that could last far beyond his time with the team. The work he put into developing players, the hours he spent helping the front office plan, it was all part of the legacy he wanted to build. At times, it felt like the intensity of basketball still clung to him. He had been so conditioned to push himself, to never back down from a challenge, that the slower pace of life now sometimes left him restless. He wasn't used to waiting, to being patient. When he wanted something, he went for it, and he expected results. But as an owner, he had to trust in the process. It was a humbling lesson, one that tested his ability to step back and let the team grow at its own pace. The relationship he had with his teammates during his playing days felt so different from the one he had with his players now. Back then, he was the leader on the floor, the one everyone looked to for guidance in the heat of the moment. Now, he was still a leader, but the dynamics had changed. He wasn't the one taking the final shot, he wasn't the one driving the team to victory. Instead, he was watching them from the sidelines, helping them learn how to lead themselves. That transition wasn't always easy for Michael, but it was necessary. The man who had once been the focal point of every game now had to take a back seat in terms of the immediate action. It was a different kind of leadership, and it wasn't always comfortable. But Michael had come to realize that it was about more than just the scoreboard. It was about building something sustainable, something that could outlast him. The drive for excellence still burned inside him. Every day was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to help the next generation of players become the best versions of themselves. Michael had never taken a day off from pushing himself to be great, and he wasn't about to start now. But as the years passed and his involvement with the Hornets continued, Michael started to understand that greatness wasn't just about wins and losses. It was about the impact he had on others, the way he could teach, mentor, and inspire. As he sat in his office, looking at the team's current lineup and thinking about the future, Michael knew that the road ahead wasn't easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But in those moments, he reminded himself of the lessons he had learned throughout his life: resilience, patience, and the belief that greatness was built over time, not overnight. And as he looked at the young players on his team, he realized that he was giving them something that no one could ever take away: the opportunity to be great. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about them. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt at peace with that. Michael Jordan sat in his office, the weight of his legacy resting heavily on his shoulders, but he was no longer sure what that legacy meant. The Hornets had made strides under his leadership, but it hadn't been the meteoric rise everyone had expected. In some ways, that frustrated him. He was used to winning, used to seeing immediate results from his efforts. But this was different. Ownership wasn't the same as being on the court, and for the first time in his life, he had to accept that some things couldn't be forced into existence. The franchise was growing, but at its own pace. The lessons weren't just about basketball, they were about life. He found himself thinking about his early years again, about the hunger he'd felt when he was a young player in Chicago, desperate to prove himself. His success had come from pushing beyond his limits, from refusing to accept defeat. Now, after years of dominance, it was harder to push beyond those same boundaries. The game, his legacy, it all felt distant in a way he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't a player anymore. He wasn't even a coach. He was an owner, and it was up to the players to make the game their own. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The stillness in his office felt different from the noise of the basketball arena. The thrill of competition was gone. Michael had always defined himself by his victories, by the shots he made, the games he won, the championships he earned. Now, there were no last-minute buzzer beaters, no high-pressure free throws with the crowd on their feet. He wasn't the one holding the ball. And for all the good he'd done with the team, for all the business deals and the moves that were finally starting to build the Hornets into a legitimate contender, there was still this feeling of emptiness. He wasn't sure what he was chasing anymore. A knock at the door pulled Michael out of his thoughts. His assistant popped her head in, offering a quick smile. "Hey, Michael. The players are wrapping up practice. I just wanted to remind you that you have a meeting with the board in an hour." "Thanks," Michael replied, his mind still lingering on the weight of his own thoughts. He'd been to hundreds of meetings like this over the years, talking strategy, finances, future goals. There was a time when those meetings had felt vital, when his input was the final word. Now, it felt more like he was watching the team from the outside, a spectator in his own story. After the meeting, Michael headed to the court. He didn't have a particular reason to be there, it was just a habit, something that always seemed to call him back. When he walked into the gym, the sound of basketballs bouncing and sneakers squeaking against the hardwood was a small comfort. It reminded him of a simpler time, when it was just about playing the game, not leading a business or making deals. He watched the team run drills, watched their movements, their intensity. They were good, no doubt. But they were still young, still learning how to work as a cohesive unit. The team wasn't yet championship material, but Michael could see the potential. That was what kept him going. He noticed one of the players, a young guard named Jason, struggling with his shooting technique. The kid had the raw talent, but he lacked the confidence that came from years of experience. Michael saw something in him, a desire to improve, to get better, to push through the doubts. He saw the same hunger that he'd once had in his own eyes. Without thinking, Michael walked over and stood next to him. "You're overthinking it," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "Relax, focus on the fundamentals. You're trying too hard to impress. Just let it flow." Jason looked up, surprised to see the legendary Michael Jordan standing beside him. I'm just trying to get it right, you know," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. Michael nodded, understanding the pressure. "I know. But trying to get it right can sometimes make you get it all wrong. Trust yourself, trust your instincts. When I was in your shoes, I spent hours on the court, just getting the basics down, working on the same shots over and over until it became second nature." The two stood there for a few more minutes as Michael worked with Jason, offering tips, adjusting his form. It was a moment of mentorship, of passing on the lessons that had taken Michael years to learn. There were no cameras, no fans watching, just two people on the court. For a moment, Michael felt that old familiar rush, helping someone else get better, watching them improve. It was why he had played the game in the first place, to push the limits, to elevate those around him. As the practice ended, Jason approached him again, this time with more confidence. "Thanks, Michael. I'll work on that." Michael smiled, watching him walk away. The kid had potential. Michael saw it clearly. There were moments when he doubted whether his impact was still significant, whether he was still relevant in the way that mattered. But moments like these quiet exchanges, reminded him that he still had something to offer. He wasn't just a symbol of the past, he was someone who could still teach, still inspire, still make a difference. That evening, after the meeting with the board, Michael sat in his office reflecting on the day. The Hornets were on their way up, but the journey was far from over. There were growing pains, mistakes, and setbacks that had to be dealt with. It wasn't as exciting as being on the court, but it was still important. The challenge of leadership had its own rewards, even if they weren't as visible as the championship trophies that had once filled his shelves. Michael realized that this was where he was meant to be now. His role had evolved. The court was no longer his domain, but the lessons he had learned there were still valuable. He had always been driven by the desire to be the best, but now he understood that greatness wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about elevating those around you, creating an environment where others could succeed. The idea of legacy had changed in his mind. It wasn't just about being remembered as the best basketball player to ever live, it was about what he left behind in the people he had helped, and the young players he had mentored, and the communities he had supported. He had built something greater than himself. His impact on the game was undeniable, but it was the way he used his platform to help others that truly mattered. As he prepared to leave the office, Michael paused for a moment, looking around the room. It had been a long road to get here. The fame, the championships, the endorsements, it had all been part of the journey. But now, he was forging a new path, one that wasn't about the accolades or the recognition. It was about the difference he could make in the lives of others, the legacy he could create by helping others rise to their potential. Michael Jordan had always been known for his determination and his refusal to back down from any challenge. But now, as he stood in the quiet of his office, he realized that the real challenge was not in basketball, it was in life, in the relationships he built, and the people he inspired. And with that understanding, Michael finally felt the peace he had been searching for. He wasn't just Michael Jordan the basketball player anymore. He was Michael Jordan the man who had learned how to give back, how to lead with humility, and how to use his success to create something even greater than himself. And that, he knew, was the true measure of greatness. Michael had spent his entire life defining success by what he could accomplish on the basketball court. Championships, MVPs, and countless accolades had been the markers of his greatness. But as he sat on the balcony of his home, overlooking the quiet neighborhood in Charlotte, he realized that those traditional measures of success had begun to lose their meaning. The basketball court, the spotlight, the media, it all seemed distant now. The thrill of competition had been replaced by something deeper, something more grounded. What did it really mean to be great, Michael thought to himself. The shift had been gradual, but unmistakable. For the first time, he wasn't trying to win a game, secure a contract, or make the next big play. He was simply living, learning how to take the lessons from his past and use them in a new way. The pressure to be the best was gone. There was no scoreboard anymore. And yet, Michael felt more fulfilled than ever before. Looking back at his time in the NBA, he could see how much his identity had been intertwined with his role as the greatest player in the league. For so many years, he had lived with that singular focus, winning, competing, proving that no one could surpass him. But now, he saw that the essence of who he was not defined by basketball alone. It had been defined by the relationships he had built, the impact he had made on the next generation, and the lessons he had learned along the way. There were moments, like the day with the elderly man, when he understood that greatness wasn't always about being in the spotlight. It wasn't about being the most visible, the most talked about, or the most admired. It was about the small acts of kindness, the quiet moments of reflection, and the ability to make a difference without fanfare. Michael had always been a man of purpose, but now, he had a clearer understanding of what that purpose truly was. His days now were filled with more than just the business of basketball. His involvement with the Hornets was fulfilling, but it wasn't the only thing that brought him satisfaction. He had become more involved in his community, attending charity events, speaking at schools, and dedicating time to causes that mattered to him. He wasn't just Michael Jordan, the NBA legend. He was Michael, the man who wanted to help others succeed, the man who wanted to leave a legacy that went beyond the court. At the same time, there was still a part of him that missed the game. Michael had spent years playing basketball with everything he had. The rush of competition, the feeling of making the big shot, of leading his team to victory, it was something he could never fully replicate in his new life. It was easy to miss the rush, but Michael knew that his purpose now was different. The lessons he had learned on the court were still valuable, but they needed to be applied in a new way. As he spent time with his family, Michael realized just how much he had missed during his playing days. He had always been a dedicated father and husband, but his time away from the game had allowed him to truly connect with his loved ones. He watched his children grow into young adults, learning from the example he had set, but also teaching him in return. They had grown up with the understanding that their father had sacrificed a lot for his career, but now, they were learning that there was more to life than basketball. They were learning the importance of relationships, of giving back, and of finding purpose in the things that truly mattered. One evening, while sitting at the dinner table with his family, Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. His wife, Yvette, was across from him, talking about their latest project, and his kids were laughing, joking, and sharing their stories from school. It was simple. It was quiet. But it was everything Michael had longed for. It was the kind of fulfillment that no amount of basketball victories could provide. As he sat there, listening to their voices, Michael realized that the greatest gift he had ever received wasn't the titles or the fame, it was the love and support of the people around him. His family had been his foundation, the reason he had worked so hard to succeed, and the reason he had pushed himself to be the best. But now, he saw that it wasn't just about what he had achieved, it was about what he could give back. His role as a mentor and leader had taken on new meaning. It was no longer just about helping players on the court. It was about helping them grow into individuals who could contribute to the world, who could use their own success to inspire others. He had always known that the greatest athletes were those who could inspire others to reach their full potential. But now, Michael saw that it was about more than just showing up on the court. It was about showing up in life, in the lives of others, and being present when it mattered most. His role with the Hornets, although challenging, had allowed him to take on a new kind of leadership. He wasn't just an owner. He was a teacher, a guide, and a mentor. And as the team began to take shape, with players like Jason, the young guard who had reminded him of his own early struggles, Michael felt a sense of pride. The team was beginning to understand the values he had lived by: hard work, humility, and the importance of always striving for greatness. Michael could see that these lessons were taking root, and that was enough for him. He wasn't looking for the spotlight anymore. He wasn't chasing the next championship. He was shaping the future, one player, one moment, at a time. But the question still lingered in his mind: what was next? Michael had lived his entire life focused on the game, and now, as he looked to the future, he wondered how he could continue to push the boundaries of his own potential. He had reached the pinnacle of basketball greatness, but he knew that there was more to be done. The challenge wasn't about the game anymore. It was about finding new ways to make a difference, to create something that would outlast him, something that could shape the world long after he was gone. As he sat back in his chair, reflecting on his journey, Michael realized that the road ahead was just as important as the one behind him. He had done more than he had ever imagined in the world of basketball. But now, it was time to take what he had learned and use it to help others, to teach, to inspire, and to lead in a new way. He wasn't just Michael Jordan the basketball player anymore. He was Michael Jordan the man who had learned that greatness wasn't just about winning, it was about the impact you had on others. And with that realization, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him. The game had given him everything, but it was time to let go of the past and embrace the future. The next chapter of his life wasn't about what he had done, it was about what he would do. And that was a challenge he was ready to take on. As the sun set over Charlotte, Michael Jordan leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the life he had lived, the one he had built with relentless ambition, unwavering dedication, and a profound love for the game. Now, years after stepping off the basketball court for good, the game no longer defined him. It was a chapter of his life that had shaped who he had become, but it was no longer the central focus of his story. His legacy, both in basketball and beyond, had taken on new meaning. He had given everything to the game, but now he was looking for something more, something deeper. The Charlotte Hornets had come a long way under his ownership. He had injected his passion for excellence into every facet of the franchise, but he knew the journey was far from over. The team was growing, evolving, and with that came its own set of challenges. Michael had always been a man who thrived on challenges, but the challenge now was different. It wasn't about making shots or winning championships. It was about making sure the Hornets were built to last, creating a sustainable culture that could withstand the test of time. And though the journey was long, Michael knew it was a journey worth taking. Sitting in his office that evening, Michael reflected on how far he had come since his playing days. The basketball court, with its adrenaline and pressure, felt like a lifetime ago. He could still hear the echoes of the buzzer beaters, the cheers of the crowd, the feeling of victory that came after every hard-fought game. Those moments were forever etched into his memory, but they were no longer the center of his world. Michael had changed, and the world around him had changed as well. The path he had walked after retirement had been one of self-discovery. He had faced new challenges, new responsibilities. But he had also found new joys, quiet moments with his family, the satisfaction of mentoring young players, and the fulfillment that came from using his platform to help others. He had become a role model, not just for his incredible skill on the court, but for the way he lived his life off of it. And as much as his legendary status in basketball would always follow him, Michael knew that the man he had become in retirement was someone he could be proud of. That day with the elderly man on the highway had been one of the catalysts for his change. It had reminded him that greatness didn't always come with applause or recognition. Sometimes, the most meaningful acts were the quietest ones, the ones done without expectation or fanfare. It wasn't the big moments that defined him, but the small ones, the ones where he had the opportunity to make a difference in someone else's life. Helping that man with the flat tire had reminded Michael that he didn't need to be in the spotlight to be truly impactful. It was about the connections he made, the lives he touched, and the people he helped along the way. His family had been at the heart of his transformation. He had always been a devoted father and husband, but the demands of basketball had often kept him away from home. Now, with the freedom to be present, Michael found that the greatest rewards weren't the championships or the accolades, they were the quiet moments spent with his wife, Yvette, and their children. Watching his kids grow, seeing them form their own dreams and ambitions, was a gift he had never fully appreciated during his playing days. And as much as he had worked to achieve success in his career, now he worked just as hard to be a better father, a better husband, and a better man. It was those quiet moments with his family that gave him the peace he had longed for. He realized that there was so much more to life than winning or losing. The true measure of success wasn't found in trophies or records, it was found in how you treated the people around you, how you built relationships, and how you left the world a better place than you found it. As Michael thought about his journey, he realized that his legacy wasn't just about being the best player to ever play the game. It was about being someone who had made a difference in the lives of others, someone who had inspired people to reach higher, to work harder, and to never give up. His role with the Hornets, his philanthropic work, and the way he mentored young athletes, it all tied together into something greater than basketball. It was about leadership, about making an impact that would last long after the final buzzer had sounded. As he prepared for another day with the team, Michael felt a sense of pride. The Hornets were still a work in progress, but the foundation had been laid. The lessons he had learned during his playing career were now being passed on to the next generation. He wasn't the one stepping onto the court anymore, but his influence was still being felt. The players looked to him for guidance, not just in basketball, but in life. And that, he realized, was the legacy he had always hoped for, not just to be remembered for his athletic accomplishments, but to inspire others to be the best versions of themselves. The future was uncertain, but Michael was at peace with it. He had spent so many years chasing success, chasing greatness. But now, he realized that the true meaning of success was not in what you had achieved, but in what you gave back. The game had given him everything he could have ever asked for, but it was the people he helped, the lives he touched, and the difference he made that would define him for years to come. As Michael stood by the court, watching the team practice, he felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. He had done it all, he had played the game, won the titles, set the records. But the most important part of his journey was yet to come. It wasn't about how many championships he could win or how many games he could dominate. It was about the legacy he could leave behind in the hearts of the people he had inspired, in the lives he had touched, and in the community he had helped build. And as he watched the young players on the court, working hard to build their own futures, Michael knew that his story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The game had given him everything. Now, it was his turn to give back. And in doing so, he would leave behind a legacy that was far more important than any championship. It was a legacy of leadership, mentorship, and the enduring belief that greatness came not just from what you achieved, but from how you lifted others up. That was the true measure of success. And that was the legacy Michael Jordan would leave behind.